clouds of political uncertainty that were looming over Japan have lifted with the re-election of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and that's helping stock prices soar to new heights. The Nikkei climbed more than 1% on Monday, entering a third week of positive gains. Abe's election campaign focused on Japan's aging population and the growing threat from North Korea. His party won a 2/3 majority in the lower house, so it seems his message resounded with voters.
I believe this election was about, firstly, the North Korean threat. You can even say that it is the biggest threat ever. And also it was about the declining birth rate. If we don't do something now, it will be too late. This is a national crisis that can't wait.
After the shock of the global financial crisis nearly 10 years ago, Abe's reforms have put the economy back on track. Japan's GDP has grown for 6 consecutive quarters, and the IMF expects the economy will expand 1.5% this year. Exports surged more than 18% in August, the biggest increase in 4 years. But real wages grew just 0.7% last month. So the economic bounty has not trickled down to workers. Japan has the highest debt among all industrialized nations, and with more than 1 in 4 Japanese above retirement age, the country's ability to keep growing is dwindling. The snap elections were called in the hopes of gathering enough support to implement changes to the Constitution. But even with that goal now accomplished, some analysts believe little will change.
The election doesn't really seem to have resolved anything in terms of controversial issues. You know, the election became very unclear as the election went on. What was it all about? Because the opposition split, and so even if you wanted to cast a vote against Mr. Abe, it wasn't clear who you should vote for.
Abe now plans to change Japan's pacifist constitution in response to threats from Pyongyang. But defusing the population bomb at home remains an elusive target. Staci Bivens, TRT World.
Now, let's discuss these points a little more in detail, and for that, I'm joined by Jean-Pierre Lehmann from the International Institute for Management Development in London. Thanks so much for joining us, Mr. Lehmann. Now, what happens now after Abe's landslide victory? Will we see any major shifts in economic policy?
No, I think some of the commentators make the good point that this is partly a political issue. I mean, it's Abe's victory, but it's also the defeat of the opposition. And I think Yuriko Koike, the governor of Tokyo, made a huge mistake in joining the fray, but then not letting herself be named as a candidate. So it's just a political issue. Then there's a structural issue. I think when they say the economy's done quite well, it's done quite well on the basis of a weak yen, and it's done quite well on the basis of considerable stimulus. But the structural reforms that Abe had promised are still nowhere near having been completed. And then, of course, as a point that's also been pointed out, the demographics. And Japan's population is, I think, the oldest in the world, and it's rapidly aging. And it's very difficult to see how the demographics can sustain continued economic growth.
Mr. Lehmann, do you think that Abe can tackle the constitutional reform that he campaigned on, and also the economic reform that is so important and worries so many people in Japan? Can he do these two things at the same time?
I mean, it'll be very interesting to see. My reaction immediately would be that no. I think obviously the North Korean threat is very considerable, but at the same time, all the surveys tend to indicate that the Japanese population is not at all open to the end of the so-called pacifist constitution. This is a big dream of Abe, whose grandfather, of course, Kishi, was in the Japanese government in Manchuria. And he wants to return Japan to having a significantly greater geopolitical and military role. But he has to get the approval not only of parliament, but of the population. I don't think he'll get it. So I think we're headed for a period of confusion, not for a period of clarity on the geopolitical front, on the constitutional front. On the economic front, as I said, we still have to see the structural reforms. So there's a tremendous amount of opposition to a number of Abenomic proposals because of vested interests. So, you know, we've seen, for example, recently there have been quite a number of scandals, Kobe Steel and so on and so forth, and reforms of corporate governance, for example, have not yet materialized.
Mr. Lehmann, thank you very much for your analysis on Japan. That was Jean-Pierre Lehmann from the International Institute for Management Development in London.